of today. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go and share my screen. So 1 second, let me go in here and share this. Cool. So 8base is a web application, similar to if you were using AWS or any major cloud provider. You go to, in this case, 8base.com, and at 8base.com, you log in, and this is where you create your workspaces, right? Now, what is a workspace? A workspace is a 3-tier serverless architecture that's hosted on AWS. API Gateway, AWS Lambda, and then Aurora MySQL as the database technology. Around that, we bring in a few peripheral resources, right? So for example, S3 for object storage, OpenID for the authentication, the API authentication protocol, as well as a few others, that we enrich that workspace with. But ideally, what you're able to do is set up the infrastructure and a lot of the application services required for a application project within 15 to 20 seconds, right? So if I were to go here and click create workspace, here I could say my workspace name, select the hosting region, then there's a number of different plans that you could select from, and click create, and that goes ahead and spins up that workspace, right? Now I'm just gonna go in here and click on my webinar workspace, which is just an empty workspace at this point. And so when we jump in, simple dashboard that gets displayed, and we have thousands of customers now, and they are all using 8base in different ways to enable different things in their development projects. However, at 8base, we usually consider the core of an 8base workspace being the data model, which is if we go to right over here, we can view. Now, as I said earlier, in that 3-tier serverless architecture, the database layer or the data layer is an Aurora MySQL database, right? So you're building on top of a relational database. And this interface is your ability to build out a relational data model. So for example, if I wanted to add a new table to my workspace, go here and let's just call this one restaurants. Now, by default, 8base is managing the ID of any record, right? And that's a UUID, so not an incrementing integer, global ID. The create at timestamp, the update at timestamp, as well as the created by relationship. So that is any record that is created by an authenticated user via the API or in the backend or in the console, excuse me. It's going to create that relationship between that user record and the record created. And so then, for example, restaurants have a name. So let's say there's a text field on that. We're going to say it's mandatory. Create that field. Restaurants have a location, right? Now, for example, if we wanted to, we could say that this was an address, right? But actually, instead, I'm going to say it's a geo field, right? So what's cool about that is for the geo field type, you can store geo coordinates in the database. So for example, lat-long or latitude and longitude coordinates. And then via the API, you're already going to have the ability to query by distance, look at or do bound calculations, all the different type of map operations that you'd want to do. They're going to be in the API ready for you to use. So create that field. And then let's also say that a restaurant has a description, right? So another simple field type, text. And let's go ahead and just create that field. Now we could keep going through here and creating multiple other fields, right? And so all the field types that you'd expect are of course available. So string or text fields, numbers, dates, switches, which are essentially Boolean or enumeration fields, files, if we want to upload pictures or images, smart fields, which are simply JSON objects with some validation on them, JSON, which is your ability to store JSON blobs in the database, and then the geo fields that we just talked about. Now I'm going to do another table called reviews, right? And so reviews have a body, which is going to be the text of the review. Let's say it can be up to 250 characters, and it's mandatory. And then reviews also have a, let's say a star rating, or let's just say rating. So we're going to say that this is a number, and the minimum value is at least 1 star, and the maximum value is at least 5, or number, right? And so our interface could reflect that appropriately. It's mandatory, and we're going to say it defaults to 3 stars. And let's also give it 1 decimal place, so if people could do like 3.5 or something like that. And now with those two things set up, now we want to relate these two tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that, hey, there is a relationship between my reviews and my restaurants table. We're going to allow multiple reviews per restaurant. That makes sense, right? And then we're going to say that on every review, the restaurant relationship is mandatory. And so then the relationship we want to call it is that this review belongs to this restaurant, and a restaurant has many reviews. So our naming conventions are accurate. However, if I wanted to, I could say this is a many-many relationship, a one-to-many relationship in either direction, a one-to-one, or belongs to, of course, if I make that a mandatory relationship. So we go back to that configuration, create the field, and now that relationship's established. And remember, for example, if we wanted to, we could make a mandatory relationship called author, right, for who wrote the review. But right now we could just rely on the fact that anyone logged in user that creates a review, it's going to be tracked. So we can always track it back to the user that created that review through the created by relationship. Now, if we wanted to, let's just go ahead and add actually, we're going to throw one more thing in here. On reviews, we're going to say that we also want an image. And so here I'm going to say it's a file, image, create that field. And now for our reviews that people are leaving in our application that we're building, or at least the back end, we can store the images associated with the review if people are taking pictures. So let's go back to reviews, and just through the admin console, which is what we're in right now, let's just create our first restaurant. So we're going to say it is Joe's Burgers. We're going to say that the latitude and longitude is, I don't really know Latin long off my head. So I'm just going to try to find maybe one here. Okay, I'm going to steal this one. I just pulled one from Google. Bam, bam, put those in. Okay, wait 1 second. And 88. Cool. And in the description, I'm going to do is great burgers, and it has no reviews yet, right? So now our first restaurant's in our database. So let's go and create 1 or 2 reviews for it. So the review is create stuff, 4 stars. I'm going to add an image. So here I'm just going to pull an image from the web. I'm just going to say burger, even though we could pull it, of course, upload from our application or any way we want to do it. That one looks good. Upload that. Cool. And I'm going to say this review belongs to Joe's Burgers. Awesome. So we have our first review now in the database. Now, what's important about this is, for example, we see that now we can set up a good data model, right? With some of our clients, we have examples of clients that have, 1 table in their database. Maybe they have a web scraper that's just throwing records into that table. We have examples of customers that have 400 tables in their database, right? Really complex business use cases with all these relationships between those tables to enable their service or their system. And so really this tool can be stretched out to accommodate any of those use cases and perform really well. So, and then based on performance, if you wanted to, for example, on my reviews table, I could add indexes or custom indexes to improve my query performance. If I wanted to, I could write a SQL view to aggregate data into a read-only table from multiple tables. There's a lot of options in here in which you can get a little bit more sophisticated if you want to. However, what we were able to see is we're able to set up a data model, right? And we could keep going with that exercise if we wanted to. And then through the console, we were just able to add some records really quickly, right? And if we wanted to, of course, we could sort through our data, filter it, add, edit, or delete any records that we want to perform those actions on. However, what the real time saver of 8base is at this point, at least, and really why it becomes a phenomenal productivity tool for a development effort. If you come from a world of, Rails applications, Django applications, Node Express applications and whatnot, or just API development, what usually you get in the rhythm of is, finding efficiencies for how do we set up CRUD APIs, and then just other service APIs as quickly as possible. 8base is doing all that work for you behind the scenes as you are building your data model, right? So for example, we just added restaurants and reviews, and now I'm going to go over my API Explorer. Now, the important thing to mention here is that this API Explorer is no different than any client application. I could be sending the same request via Postman, graphical, a React Native application, a React Vue.js application, whatever I want. Every workspace that you create gets an API endpoint, which you can find right here. And then every GraphQL query that you want to run or send to your API, you send as a post request to this API endpoint. It translates it and sends you back the data you're requesting. So for example, if I wanted to query a list of all my restaurants, oh, excuse me, I'm going to go for restaurants. And let me see, I can autocomplete. I want to know how many restaurants I have in my database. I want to know how many items, or for every item that I'm getting back, which is a restaurant in this case, I want to know the ID of the restaurant. I want to know the name. I want to know the description. And I want to know the location, which is an object. And so I want the coordinates of it. So I run that query, and that's the data I'm getting back out of my system, right? Now, what's cool about the GraphQL piece as well is that the query that I write, the shape of that query is the shape of the data that I get back. So it's a highly predictable API. It's never that you're hitting some type of just static endpoint and getting some blob, JSON blob back that then you have to sort through and kind of figure out what's available to you. Now, what's also great about these queries is that they're all generated relationally, right? So right now we can think of it as we hit an endpoint that gave us back a list of our restaurants, right? Or we ran a query that did that. Now, if we were using let's say a traditional REST API, we'd probably then have to hit a separate endpoint for all our reviews for that restaurant, right? So now we have the ID, then we hit the other endpoint, say, now give me the reviews that belong to this restaurant ID, and kind of go through that pattern. However, based on the queries being relational, we could just say, hey, well, actually, I want this restaurant's reviews, and I want to know how many it has again. And then for these ones, for every review it has, I want to know the ID, the body, I want to know the rating, cool, and I want to know when it was created at. So now I run that, and that's all coming back in one response for me, right? So really, really clean interface. And of course, these queries can go as deeply nested as you would want. So for example, if we now wanted to know, hey, who is that review created by? I could go in here and I want their email, their first name, and their last name. Once again, now, so this is 3 levels deep, and it's giving me all 3 levels back in one really clean object, right? So really cool, powerful querying interface there, which is also enriched, for example, with all the operations we'd need for pagination, sorting, grouping aggregation, filtering, search, all that type of stuff is built into the API. So for example, if I wanted to filter by restaurants, maybe there'd be some type of tags or whatnot that we'd implement, but let's just say that I wanted to go by the name contains the word burger. I can do that, and then of course I'm getting burger back, right? Because that's the one that we have in our database. However, if I ask for taco, I'm searching, there's no tacos here, right? So by default, for queries, which are read operations against the database, you have this operation, which is the list operation, right? I want to get back a list of many records, as well as you have the single action or the single record read operation, to where you are saying, hey, find me this record by its ID or any unique and mandatory field, right? And what's cool about GraphQL as well is that it's a self-documenting specification. So for example, if I wanted to know more about this restaurant's list operation, I could click on it, and it's going to pop up in my documentation here and show me all of the response types that I can get back from the query, all the arguments I can get back from the query, as well as, of course, any inputs, or you can drill down into all those arguments and look at all the different types that they support and whatnot. And that is for every operation that's on your API. So really transparent, really great way of keeping up with allowing your development team to have a resource that is highly transparent. You're never having to go tap some guy on the shoulder and be like, oh, well, how did you design this, 6 months ago or whatnot. Now, so that's for the read operations. When it comes to the write operations, though, those are mutations. So for example, I'll go to mutation here, and I'm just going to type in rating, which was another table that we created. And so what's super cool about that is that we have the ability now to create ratings, create many at one time, update them by filters, so updating many at one time. Delete and destroy, that's hard delete versus soft delete. And so really any of the CRUD operations that you would expect from a CRUD API in many different flavors are just there for you to use, right? Already after doing our data model, we could have handed our endpoint off to a front-end developer and then reading and writing data from the system. And that's, once again, also enriched with subscriptions. Subscriptions are super cool because that's essentially your ability to have a client application subscribe to real-time events in the on the database, right? So for example, if a client application doesn't want to poll and doesn't want to have to refresh the page to get new data, you can start a subscription connection that says, oh, well, whenever a create event or a update event or a delete event happens on this table or a subset of records on that table, send me some data back and let me know about it. And that's a WebSocket subscription handled over AWS Lambda. So for example, at 8base or other of our agency partners, whenever anyone's building messaging applications, real-time notification feeds, anything along those lines, subscriptions are a core feature or technology that they get to utilize. So at this point, what we're seeing is that, hey, we can create a great data model, right? We then have a really powerful API that's immediately stood up that we can start using. However, it tends to beg the question, well, how can I make sure that only the right actors are performing the right actions via my API? You know, for example, if I'm the owner, let's say, of a restaurant, right? How do I make sure another owner isn't deleting my listing or someone isn't updating someone else's review, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into app services here and look at roles. Roles are essentially your permission or your ability to say what any user with one or more roles, what actions can they perform when hitting the API with when they're authenticated. Guest allows you to specify what unauthenticated people can do via the API. So if you want to have public features on your API, you can do that as well. So I'm going to go here and I'm just going to say, let's say that there is a reviewer role, right? So this is a user of the system, a user who leaves reviews on restaurants. Cool. I'm going to add that role. And now we're going to be specific here about what someone that is a reviewer can do, right? Now remember, a user can have many roles, right? There's a roles table, there's a users table, and some many connection between the two of them. But it's good to be specific with a single role about what's enabled for it. So first off, I'm just going to turn off some of the things that are enabled for restaurants. So I'm just going to say they can't read restaurants, they can't do this, they can't do that. Cool. So a reviewer should be able to create reviews. That makes a lot of sense. So we're going to leave that one checked. When it comes to reading reviews, they should be able to read all records, right? So we're not going to protect any review that is published, anyone can read. When it comes to updating reviews, however, we're going to say that they can only update the reviews that they've created. Makes sense, right? And then when it comes to deleting reviews, that is a compound. So if they have the update permission and the delete permissions checked, we're going to make sure we're going to allow them to delete the reviews that they've created. Or we can say they can't delete them. Let's just turn it off for now and saying that if you leave a review, it's up forever. So then I'm going to go to custom access here. And I'm going to say, okay, well, actually, I don't want them to be able to manage at all whether the times with which a review was created or updated. And then they can only, let's say that they can only create the rating once, but they can't change the rating after, but they could update the body text maybe. So this allows us, even for if someone has access to updating a record, we can permission which fields they can actually read, update, or not see at all. The API would never return them. So pretty fine-grained controls there. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to say that actually they can read all restaurants, right? Because they need to see the restaurants that they are reviewing, okay? And then when it comes to updating restaurants, what we're going to do is they actually need to be able to update the relationship between a review and a restaurant, right? So they're going to need to see all records or be able to update all restaurants. But what we're just going to do is we're going to turn off the, one second, custom access. We're going to just make these all read only so that they can't update any information or any of the fields on the restaurant record. So save that. Now, one important thing here is right here, we've just been using kind of these high level options, right? Like all records, users records, no records, stuff like that. However, if you want to dive a level deeper, it's totally available to you. And now what would a level deeper mean? So for example, here it's saying that the user's records, right? But how does 8base track that? Well, it's actually a custom filter under the hood. So here what we're seeing is that on the reviews records, we're saying that the user can update it if this filter passes. It was created by a user whose ID equals the logged in user ID, right? So that filter is always going to be enforced on any API call from a reviewer to make sure that this checks out and then allow or not allow that operation to be run, which would be a review update operation, right? However, if we want to take this, let's do it this, let's say that there was two different types of conditions that we wanted to check for. So we're going to say or here, we're going to drop that in as 1. And then what we're going to say is the other one is, okay, they could do it if it was created by the ID where it was created by a user where the ID equals the logged in user, or we could say that they can update it if it was, let's look for if the rating. Oh, let's see which ones we have access to here. All right, 1 second. Let's save that. Was I on the, oh, I think I actually, yeah, I was on reviews. Okay, cool. So I'm going to do that, go in there. And so then I'm going to say if the rating is less than 2 stars, right? That's probably not a very good rule, but we're saying that, hey, if a rating was less than 2 stars, you can go and update that review as well, right? However, you could go through any type of relationships here. You can check any type of predicate based on a field type and really get fine-grained about what type of users can do perform what type of actions. And really at 8base, this is what's enabled us to build full multi-tenant business systems in fintech, health tech, any industry. We really have a pretty impressive portfolio of projects we've been able to do, and this is one of the core enablers behind it. So it's a really powerful tool. I'm just going to delete that right there and save it. Cool. And so now that we kind of have this role created, we can ask ourselves, well, how do we associate roles with users, right? And there's actually a few ways that we can do that. The first thing that's important to talk about is probably the authentication piece, right? So 8base is not an authentication provider. We do not store username and passwords, right? We work with any authentication provider that is OpenID compliant. So if you currently have a user database in Auth0, Okta, Cognito, anywhere, you don't even have to migrate users to 8base. You can just configure that authentication profile with 8base so that when they issue your users in your client application a token, that can be used as the authentication credential with 8base. So for example, if I went here and wanted to create a new authentication profile, I could do that. And what I have is a few things. So first off, this might sound a little contradictory to what I said, where it says 8base authentication. Really, at the end of the day, that is just us using Cognito behind the scenes to enable very simple email password sign up. We encourage you to use it as like a development service, not your production authentication provider. However, it's just something to help people get started quickly. However, if I wanted to use OpenID, I could go and drag and drop or paste in the OpenID URL here, give this authentication profile a name. That means that whenever 8base is reading the incoming token, we can match it to the auth profile and then go verify the token at the appropriate provider. And once you configure that, you're able to say, okay, well, only allow people to sign up that have a specific email domain. Anyone can sign up. It's invite only, so no self sign up, some basic options there. However, let's say that if we did open to all, we could say, okay, well, anyone that signs up is going to be a reviewer for our app, right? And so at initial authentication, the user would be automatically assigned the role. So as soon as they start hitting the API, they have the appropriate role to start acting or acting within the application as they should be able to. Now, after that though, applications usually need the ability to, how does someone upgrade? How does someone change roles? You know, you can stack all these things as you want. Now, this is a point about 8-base I think is really powerful to understand the flexibility of using 8-base as a development tool. Right now, for this, for what we've been doing, we've been playing around completely just within the 8-base console, right? Which might make you think, oh, if I want to do any of these things that we're doing, I have to go log into the 8-base console and perform them here. Well, actually, that's not true, because 8-base is really just one big backend API. And even the console that we're looking at right here is just our client interface to help you manage those resources, when really you could perform any of these things on the API itself. So for example, if I wanted to do a mutation in my own system where I create a new table, I could do that from a script in one of my client applications, right? If I wanted to add fields to that table, if I wanted to create new roles, if I wanted to do anything, it's all API enabled. So of course, if I want to reassociate roles or connect users with new roles, I can just do that all programmatically and permission through my roles and permissions, whether or not, or what different people are able to do. This means that you can create scripts for scaffolding your own 8-base resources or projects. You can even extend the ability of creating schema and database resources for specific users from your client applications. Super, super flexible, right? So really, we rarely ever come across a project that 8-base cannot accommodate because of that API first architecture. Yeah, super cool stuff. So after that, what I'm going to jump into here really quickly is just some platform stuff, right? So general billing and team administration, the things that you'd expect from a backend-as-a-service. However, we also have is API tokens, right? So if you don't want to, or if a part of your software system that you're building requires a static token to be issued, you can create an API token, right? So ID tokens that are used to authenticate via the API are expiring, and you essentially use your session credentials. Whereas an API token is a one-time static token that you can associate a role with, save, and then it will never expire. That's great for if you want to authenticate, let's say a CI/CD deploy from GitHub to your 8-base workspace. You can use an API token as a GitHub secret or GitLab secret, whichever you're using, to enable that. Or I've seen more sophisticated use of API tokens to where, for example, you have a table that's tracking individual IoT devices, each one having an associated API token, which is all programmatically generated. The IoT device stores that token, and then the device itself has its own role to where it can only access certain records in the database, only make certain types of API calls, and you're essentially very easily building the backend infrastructure for managing an IoT fleet. Some pretty cool stuff you can do and use the API tokens for, which is simply giving your token a name and then selecting which role that token will have. However, at this point, what's important to see is that, okay, well, we are able to create a workspace, create some data model or some schema inside that workspace, immediately have an API that we can start using to get data in and out of that API, then permission the types of users that we want, so the roles and permissions piece. And now, with those resources themselves, we are handling a significant percentage of what is a backend project, right? However, let's say that if that's covering the 70 or 80% of all the backend work that we have to do to get started, and even more than started, that what's left over is usually what's the unique ID, right? So that is the unique parts of the idea or the application that you're building that you really need to spend most of your time on. So what we decided to do to enable that was allow developers to essentially write JavaScript functions or Lambda functions and deploy them to the backend in a very streamlined deployment cycle. So what I'm going to do really quickly is I'm going to create a new screen share and go over to my code editor here. And so we have the 8-base command line tool, right? Which is you start install with npm yarn, whichever package manager you're used to using. And so I'm just going to run 8base init. I'm going to say I'm initializing a new project. And I'm going to say that this is webinar functions. And I'm just going to say the syntax is JavaScript. We support TypeScript or JavaScript. You don't have to compile them yourselves. The command line tool handles everything. So whichever one you're more comfortable using or prefer to use, you're able to. So once I run this command, which it says I need to update, we can go through and select which workspace we're going to connect to. So I'm going to connect my webinar workspace. And that's just saying, hey, which backend will you be deploying these functions to? And so now I'm going to go in and just add a folder to this workspace, which if I go into, let me see if I can find this really quickly. Users, Sebastian, code, 8base, webinar functions. Cool. I've added it now to my IDE. Awesome. So looking through these, if you're familiar with serverless framework, this is going to be very reminiscent of serverless framework. We did not use serverless as part of our tech stack, but we adopted a lot of patterns from it because we liked how it was organized. So at the core, we have an 8base.yaml file, which in here we have the declarations for all the different functions that we have. Now, these are just example functions that were generated with an empty project or with a new project, which you could initialize empty if you wanted to. But it will give us a really great schedule of talking about each one. So the first function type that we offer is the resolver function. So the same way that on our GraphQL API, we had the ability to query a list of restaurants or create many reviews at one time, you can add any custom operation to your GraphQL API. And so, for example, if you wanted a really easy one of leaving a rating on a restaurant, right? I mean, you could just do a update one by 8base, but let's say there was something custom about it. You could say, my custom review adder, something like that. And then if I go into here, which is where my resolvers are, and this one's just called resolver, I then have my schema.graphql file where I essentially do the type, or I can specify whether it's a query or mutation, and then declare my typed inputs and my typed output, right? And then once I do that, I have my handler function, which essentially allows me to write any JavaScript code, all right? So this is a Node.js runtime, Node 10, I believe, and any NPM package, any yarn package, any SDK I want to import. If you're used to developing with Node, this is going to feel like you're at home. I can do it all in here. So I'm going to go back to my APS.yaml file. The second type of function that we offer is task functions. That's essentially your ability to write code that is a function that's invocable from other functions. There's a few enrichments around that, but super useful. The other thing that you can do with a task, which is great, is you can run them on schedules. So for example, if I wanted to run this one on a schedule at a rate of every 4 days, I could run that schedule on that interval. This is just a simplified syntax that we offer. However, this also supports cron jobs. So if you want to specify a cron job on here, that will be the interval at which your function invokes. So super handy. Webhooks, right? So on the end of that API endpoint, which is your workspace, you can have the option of specifying a path and an HTTP verb on which that will invoke a specific function. So a good example of this is, let's say you're expecting a callback from Stripe whenever a transaction happens. You can say, Stripe, send it to this endpoint with this path, using this verb, and then you will receive the payload inside the function that 8base is hosting for you and do whatever you want with it in there. And then finally, triggers, which are probably one of the most used ones, which this is your ability to invoke a function either before or after any create, update, or delete event that happens on a table or a record in that table. Now, that's great for if you want to perform like complex validations. So let's say that you want every time before a restaurant was created, you wanted to check your database that restaurant doesn't exist, and maybe you had a third-party database that you wanted to go make some API call to check something else and perform any type of script or run any type of script. You have the ability to do that, and then of course reject or accept or even manipulate the input to that create action. It's all there for you to use. as well as then with an after trigger to where maybe after, let's say in the same example, maybe after restaurant was created, you wanted to send the owner an email, you wanted to kick off some type of custom workflow, any of those types of things, you'd be able to perform in an after trigger. So really flexible. Now, if we went to that trigger, let's just do that one here. So for example, this is the function that we have, and this is showing that you could override a variable if you wanted to. However, I'm just going to delete these here, the encode in the code, and essentially, let's say that we wanted to write some function, right? So I'm just going to say that we have a constant here called change, and change equals my new value, right? Let's say that this was an extremely useful and important function that we wanted to author. What we can then do is test it locally to see if it's performing as expected. So I'm just going to add change to our return value here. And what I'm able to do is I'm able to say, hey, what is the input that I want to provide this function when testing it locally, so I can test different scenarios. So inside of each of these function directories, we have a mocks file with a mock JSON file in it, and I can have multiple of these. So here I'm just saying that, okay, well, the event argument is going to be stubbed with data, foo bar, and the headers, and then the body, right? So if I go into here now, and I just take this from the encode documentation. So here I'm writing 8-base invoke local trigger. That's the name of our function in this example. And then mock request, which is the name of our mock file. It could be success, failure, anything you want to call it. I can run that locally, and it's gonna run this function, and I can see that, okay, well, the expected return result is coming back for me. Now, let's say that we went through and we created all these functions. If I wanted to, I could create a new function, for example, 8-base, generate a new task called my special task. And I'm just gonna say that it's JavaScript again. Cool. I run that, and that takes care of scaffolding up the files and the directories that I need for creating that new task, as well as adding the declaration here in my 8-base.yaml file. So if I want to, which I do, I can just run 8-base deploy, and that's actually going to handle all the compilation, packaging, deployment, and everything, getting my functions up and live on my workspace, right? So super streamlined, easy way of deploying these functions. Now, what I imagine you might be thinking is, okay, well, that's great if I'm in development potentially, but how does it work once I'm in production and I want to do testing with environments, kind of like what's CI/CD look like with this tool? We built CI/CD natively into 8-base. And so essentially what we have the ability to do is, let me see if I can open a new terminal, split terminal. Cool. Right here is, so as this is deploying, I can say 8-base environment list. And so I'm pretty sure that in this workspace that I created, I've not enabled CI/CD, or I have, but it's just one environment, right? So like I said, for the sake of development, we're just pushing this environment. And if I wanted to, I could, of course, commit this code to a GitHub or GitLab repository, and then have an action script or some type of script in there deploy these changes after checks go on them. However, what the command line tool allows me to do, if I wanted to, I'm just going to say the help command so we can see the different commands here, is if I wanted to, I could branch from my master environment, a staging environment, I could branch from staging, a development environment, and then maybe from there I would do different feature branches. Each of these now would then be part of an implied development or deployment chain, to where then it wouldn't just allow me to override changes on my master, right? Which is in that example, the production environment. I would have to deploy my changes to the youngest child environment, right? So development, and then 8-base would allow me to, or would manage the migrations between those environments for me. And what's super cool about that is each of those environments that I create have their own API endpoint, they have their own database, they have their own data. They're completely isolated environments. So if I wanted to connect them to different client applications or give different testing or QA teams access to each individual one separately, I have that full flexibility of doing that. So it really gives me kind of a structured way of approaching that development effort that will be consistent throughout many projects. So if I have 20 engineers working on 20 different projects on 8-base, there's a lot of convention and maintainability that comes into play there, because they're all being built in a very consistent way that any of my engineers that are working on there could probably jump into any of those different projects and pick it up in a heartbeat, because we brought the convention required to the table. So I am going to stop talking at this point. Thank you guys for your attention. It was about 40 minutes. And if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them now. And we can, of course, dive back into any part of the platform or whatever it is that people want to learn more about. So I'm going to open the, I'm going to stop sharing, and I can always jump back into the share if I need to, so I can look at any questions or comments or be part of the chat. So thank you, and all your time now.